Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second retro seminar of this term. My name is Rita Mota, and I'm the Intesa Sanpaolo Research Fellow at the Oxford University Center for Corporate Reputation. With me today is Alan Morrison, Professor of Law and Finance here at the Saïd Business School in Oxford, who co-convenes retro with me, and our guest speaker, Caleb Bernacchio. Caleb is an assistant professor of ethics and management in the College of Business at California State University Monterey Bay. He's an expert on business ethics, and his research focuses on the intersection of organization theory, micro-level strategy, and virtue ethics. Caleb has published exciting and important work on a number of topics, including employee rights, participatory governance, and organizational routines. He's also a member of the editorial board at Business Ethics Quarterly. I'll turn the floor over to Caleb in a moment, but before I do so, let me just say a few quick words about the seminar. Many of you are regular attendees and so have heard much of this before, but for those of you who are here for the first time, let me give you some context. Retro, that is reputation, ethics, trust, and relationships at Oxford, is a seminar series that is concerned with the ethical and normative content of trust and reputation in organizational life. The seminar series started in January 2020, moved online when the pandemic made in-person events impossible, and has been generously supported by the Center for Corporate Reputation since the beginning. Although many academic events are now going back to an in-person format, Alan and I have decided to keep retro online because this is the best way to continue to include people from all over the world. It is undeniable that having such a wonderfully diverse group of people in the virtual room makes for much more stimulating discussions. So thank you for coming and for being part of this community. And I would also like to thank the people who make retro possible. Rupert Younger, director of the CCR, who's always been supportive of this series in every possible way. Hannah Cooper, Chris Page, Marquise Morgan, and Darius Jawa, who do all of the crucial backstage work to make these seminars happen. And of course, Alan, whose knowledge and wisdom have been essential to the existence and success of the series. Today's seminar addresses a very important and interesting topic related to the ways in which markets can function in a more ethical way. This is, of course, a question that we care about deeply here at the CCR, as we try to understand and study the ways in which people relate to one another, trust each other, and work to create value for multiple stakeholders. Caleb is going to argue that the market failures approach to business ethics is not sufficient to provide business people with clear guidance, and that well-functioning markets require virtues like honesty, justice, and respect. Caleb is going to show us that morality should play a role in markets that cannot be restricted to the prevention of market failures. And he's going to help us to understand what society has to gain from fostering the development of virtue in markets. I am very much looking forward to hearing what Caleb has to say on this important topic, and I'm sure that we'll have a very lively discussion after his presentation. Caleb will speak for around 20 to 30 minutes. After that, we will have some time for questions and answers. Now, most of you already know how this works. Please enter your questions and comments into the Q&A box, not the chat, and either Alan or I will relay them to Caleb. You can find the Q&A button either at the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on the device that you are using. And we're going to finish promptly at 5 p.m. as usual. Caleb, thank you so much for being here today. The floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks to Alan and Rita and the center, of course, and everyone for attending. So this is a really great opportunity to kind of present some this research project, really. So I really like to give a little background here. I'm going to share my screen, but this is part of a larger project. It's really part of a book project, which is to give a comprehensive account of the ethics of markets and firms from a virtue ethical perspective. And so I want to integrate a couple different streams of research within business ethics. And another aim is to really give a bit more of a kind of philosophical background for or motivation for the virtue ethical perspective. I think it's really important that we understand kind of more broadly about, why it might make sense to look at things from this perspective before we start thinking about these kind of more applied issues. So yeah, so I'll give a little bit more background, as I begin before I get into the kind of specific arguments. But so first off, I think it's important to think about what virtue ethics is not. There's a lot of misconceptions and yeah, so I think it's extremely helpful to kind of think about this. So first off, it's not the pursuit of a sideways on conception of human flourishing. This is a term from John McDowell. But the idea is that, human flourishing or well-being would be essentially something given, something morally neutral, and the virtues would be defined in terms of their role of facilitating or promoting, realizing this kind of morally neutral notion of flourishing. So I think this is problematic for a number of reasons, but I mean, the most obvious is just that I think it makes little sense to think about flourishing or well-being in morally neutral terms. I mean, on my view, flourishing is really about fulfilling various roles well in life, and these are inevitably morally laden, the way we explain them and understand them, involving notions of excellence and various virtues. And so, so in a sense, virtue goes into the way we think about well-being or flourishing, the end, right, as opposed to just being a means. Related to this is the idea that virtues are dispositions to follow rules. Again, this is a very common notion. I mean, in quite a bit of the literature in a lot of varied areas. So this assumes that rules are already determinate. So on this view, virtues are basically motivational factors. They're sort of supplements to the normative principles that are governing, some area of life or some considerations, and but with this view in mind, it becomes hard to think about why talk about virtues. Those are secondary. Yeah, it's nice that people are motivated to follow moral rules or norms, but they don't seem so important. But again, this assumes that these rules are already determinate. Another view would just be that virtues are types of rules. So Joseph Heath, in an essay about virtue ethics, so he's, for those who aren't familiar, he's kind of one of the main proponents of the market failures approach. He, in some sense, assumes this kind of view when he talks about virtue ethics as being kind of an example of an implied ethical approach. So you would have kind of a set of virtues, and these would be just applied to business. So again, this kind of takes it that virtues are determinate, given before their application in specific contexts. So a more adequate view of what virtues are is to see them as capacities for practical judgment. So for any virtues, we can come up with rules. Rosalind Hursthouse talked about the rules. So be honest, be fair, be kind. So I mean, there's no problem with doing that, but we have to recognize that the virtues or V rules, such as be honest, are not determinate on their own. They only become determinate through the judgments of the virtuous person. So in some sense, it's a really radical rethinking of how norms become determinate. And it's not always recognized, I think, in debates about virtues, especially in applied contexts like business ethics. So it's also worth thinking about virtues, the relationship between virtues and moral rules. So a key idea here is the uncodifiability thesis. Again, this owes a lot to John McDowell, but you could also say that McIntyre's focus on practices, Alistair McIntyre's focus on practices, is also related to this idea. So this is the idea that no set of rules is adequate to fully account for our moral obligations given the complexity of the social context. So again, on this view, it's basically saying that rules are secondary, and because of the complexity, of our world, we can't think about rules as providing sufficient guidance for action. So this is supported by a view that's made prominent by Jonathan Dancy. So this is just maybe one way of supporting it, and but I think it gives a nice basis. So holism about reasons is the idea that reasons can alter their polarity or their valence in different contexts. So so for example, if say my actions are causing pain to someone, that might be a reason to stop. But if I'm a physical therapist, it might actually be a reason to continue doing what I'm doing. Again, maybe I have to test and see whatever the range of motion that someone has. So, I mean, the idea is that reasons don't stand independently of the context, and again, they don't combine in a kind of simply simplistic or additive way. So there's a complex set of factors whenever we're thinking about what kind of reasons for action we have in any given context. And there's no way for rules to, at an abstract level, just sort of spell this out. So essentially, virtues involve the ability to recognize specific reasons for action. So salient reasons for action in specific contexts. And so they comprise a capacity for judgment. And they give norms a determinate content. And so this essentially rejects the primacy of rules. So, I think we need to keep this perspective in mind when we go into the more applied context of, debating about how it makes sense to think about, again, specific issues in business ethics or other applied contexts. All right, so we'll kind of hold on to this, and this will kind of come up throughout the rest of the rest of the paper. So one other background I think I didn't mention yet, but so like I said, this is part of a book project. So this is really one part of the project. It's really a couple of chapters, aspects of a couple of chapters, and so the idea is that to look at the ethics of markets from a virtue ethics perspective. But a big part of my argument is that we can't fully understand the claims made about the role of the virtues in the market, in a market context, without also understanding the ethics of the firm. So the MFA has been very strong. The market failures approach has been very strong, thinking about the role of ethics in markets. There's been less work that's dealt with virtues. There's been a little bit, but in virtues in a market context. But virtue ethics, you might say, the strength has been thinking about the role of ethics within firms. So part of the project is to kind of bring these together. So just kind of keep this in mind. This is one aspect focused on markets, but we don't get the full picture without kind of integrating it with some of this other work in virtue ethics about firms. All right, so just a quick summary. So the market failures approach is a prominent theory of business ethics focused on really the ethics of markets. It is incredibly insightful and an interesting way to think about the role of ethics in an economic context. So essentially, it says that markets exist to minimize the waste of societal resources, basically to promote Pareto efficiency or Pareto efficient outcomes. So market actors, including managers, should respect the social purpose of markets by avoiding market failures. So again, the idea is that the role for ethics here, in a large part, comes from the fact that regulations are necessarily incomplete. We can't rely on regulations to adequately, structure the market so that they're efficient. So there's a real role for market actors, and again, especially managers. And so there's this list of efficiency imperatives. I won't go through all of these in depth, but you can kind of see that they account for the main factors that would undermine the efficiency of markets. So actually, so just an aside here before we get into this problem related to this. So the MFA focuses on really efficiency as the institutionalized goal of markets. And it's been thought that this is incompatible with virtue ethics. So I think the idea is that, virtues focus on, flourishing or the common good. So they have no way of allowing for, institutional or the moral division of labor, as it's sometimes called. So institutionalized values that kind of prioritize the certain values over others. So Heath actually talks about deontic weakening. So the idea would be that norms in the market context become weaker. Again, I mean, if we think about this in terms of this uncodifiability thesis and the virtue ethical perspective that outlined in the beginning, the perspective changes because this idea of deontic weakening assumes that norms are determinate before we get to social context. That's how they're weakened when you get into the context of the market. If you reject that idea, then there's no real problem with a moral division of labor. I mean, the point is that in different social contexts, different values are salient, different reasons for action are salient. In a market context, because of the importance of markets to, social welfare and freedom and all these other important aspects of human life, morally salient aspects of human life, it makes sense to prioritize values like efficiency. So anyway, just as an aside, I don't think that it's correct that virtue ethics is incompatible with this sort of moral division of labor that's central to the MFA. All right, so now there's a problem for this. This has been noted in the literature before, and this is really nothing new to note this problem. But the problem is related to the theorem of the second best. So essentially, market failures may be offsetting. So given the presence of market failures, following the efficiency imperatives need not lead to greater efficiency. So again, the idea is that, if markets are imperfect, more closely approximating, an efficient market doesn't necessarily lead to greater efficiency. So, this is a problem because now we can't really say that the efficiency imperatives give determinate guidance. Following them doesn't ensure that you're acting on, you're promoting the key values of the market or the kind of Pareto efficiency. Again, it raises this question: doesn't ensure that social purpose of markets is promoted. So, I suggest that this is one instance of this kind of larger problem related to the uncodifiability thesis. That once we get into a specific context, we can't take these rules as giving us, we can't take rules or norms as giving us sufficient guidance. So Heath's response here is to say that efficiency imperatives are normally correct. So again, he's thinking of this in a statistical sense, Again, Joseph Heath, kind of main proponent of the MFA, or one of the main proponents of the MFA, and this has been debated in the literature, and his response is to say that these imperatives are normally correct. But again, it's not so clear that this is true. So again, if we consider the first efficiency imperative, minimize negative externalities. So taken literally, this rules out nearly all transactions. Again, think about pollution. I mean, any sort of value chain, materials are being delivered, externalities involved in delivering products to customers, also noise. I mean, frequently during the pandemic, when I've been working from home, or people, there's been work on people's houses, so these are externalities that are part of exchange, and so we also can't appeal to the idea of like, okay, well, minimize externalities unless they're small. Again, as we know from climate change, right? I mean, small externalities can add up to big problems. This is something Derek Parfit deals with quite a bit in Reasons and Persons. This question of this kind of small harms that are caused by action. So it's really not clear that we could appeal to this idea to, say, refine this imperative. But clearly, some externalities are problematic. So I mean, we can't just dismiss this concern. I mean, so the MFA is correct, in my opinion, to see this as a key moral problem of markets. So I mean, the first conclusion is that a capacity for judgment. What again in the virtue ethics perspective, which has been called practical wisdom or phronesis. So some capacity for judgment is needed to understand how to apply this norm properly. So again, this is a specific instance of this uncodifiability thesis. So part of the aim here is to sort of say that it makes sense to look at this from a virtue ethics perspective for some of these kind of problems that are associated with uncodifiability. But we can see this in a little bit more depth when we think about how externalities are actually dealt with in the real world, and this is related to the virtue of justice. So again, institutions in the real world exist in large part, or at least in part, to remedy these problems. So we can't really think about how people deal with externalities without thinking about their interactions with various institutions. So again, institutions do this by allocating rights and duties. And here's the link with justice. So again, think about property laws, laws regulating noise, waste, transfer payments, all kind of incentives, to promote sustainable production. When we think about how someone might follow the first efficiency imperative, or at least how they might follow it in a way that doesn't just mean eliminating all transactions, right? It's going to be a matter of acting justly, because institutions exist to deal with these problems. So there's no other way around this. There's no other norm or decision procedure that you could appeal to that would solve these kind of problems. So it's going to be a matter of respecting persons' legally defined rights. Again, this is when someone's causing noise, or through their work or whatever. Well, the way you can think about if this externality is allowed is going to be a matter of what does the law allow? Am I overstepping my bounds as far as what kind of disturbance I'm causing? And again, the same thing with pollution, but also recognizing limitations of the law. So in a concrete way, we can recognize that, well, the law should account for this, and it doesn't. So I have some obligation to respect people's moral rights. And again, it requires practical wisdom when thinking about this issue. There's no way to get around the role for judgment in this context. So, here's kind of two virtues that we can see that play a key role in thinking about how the efficiency imperatives, in this case, the first efficiency imperative, could actually become concrete and be realized in a good way. But we can also think a little bit more about Heath's response to this theorem of the second best. So Heath gives a little bit more of a response to this, and he gives an example. And so basically, he's talking about medical students. I won't read it the whole thing, but he's talking about medical students. He's basically saying, look, when they're trained to learn to diagnose, illnesses, they're supposed to focus on, common illnesses. They can get lost by focusing on these exotic illnesses. And so again, when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. So, so I'm not really sure what this example can be taken to show. I don't think it shows that rules are adequate in any real way. Again, we're talking about medical school, not WebMD, and I don't know. I mean, many of us probably know people who go to WebMD constantly for any sort of symptom that shows up, right? And so WebMD doesn't make us all doctors. So it's really important that we think about this example, and that rules play a role in training medical students, but they're not sufficient, and no one would just think that again, because we have this kind of set of symptoms linked with various illnesses, that we can dispense with doctors. So again, we have to think about a capacity for judgment, and actually much of the literature, many papers discussing medical school and training of med students appeal to an idea of practical wisdom. So, I mean, there's a real sense in which this example doesn't actually support the idea that the efficiency imperatives as a set of rules are a sufficient perspective. And so I think it supports the idea that, again, we should think about how do people develop this capacity to act well in a market context. So develop this capacity for judgment. I think we can also think about this in terms of the virtue of honesty. See my time here. And so the virtue of honesty, we can link this with the third imperative. So reduce information asymmetries between firms and customers. But again, in the real world where limited information asymmetries are pervasive, they may be offsetting. So it's not very far-fetched to think about, people have, false beliefs about product components, for instance. And, so sharing information, may eliminate or prevent beneficial transactions, mutually beneficial transactions. So, again, in our world where, where the craziest ideas are spread on social media, people might think that, some sort of manufacturer, some sort of supplier, some sort of component in the product is involved with mind control or some sort of other conspiracy theory, right? And so following this imperative, may not lead to more mutually beneficial transactions. It may lead to, these situations where people don't engage in transactions because of this false information. So, of course, this raises these complex questions about, the value of information, consent, or well-being, how all these factors interrelate. But this can only be addressed through the virtues of honesty and practical wisdom. Again, there's no way around this in the real world where it's just not possible to, just reduce information asymmetries completely. And so we're always going to be deciding, when does it make sense to do this, or when does it not make sense to do that? And so again, we see these role for these virtues. So this kind of concluding this first part, in the second part will be a bit shorter. So I know I'm coming up on time here, but so why does the MFA need virtue? Well, first off, efficiency imperatives are indeterminate. There's no way to refine these norms to avoid this indeterminacy, and a capacity for judgment is needed, involving practical wisdom, justice, and honesty. And again, we could point to other virtues here. But so this is one reason. So this problem of indeterminacy, or so again, a key question for business ethics is how this capacity is developed. So I don't think it makes sense to think about what rules are needed, but again, how can we think about how this capacity for judgment is developed in a market context? All right, so now the second role for morality in the market. So there's a positive role for the virtue. So again, the MFA focuses on this role of preventing market failures. So the virtues have a positive role in facilitating additional transactions and creating more value within existing transactions. So what I want to suggest is that if we only look at things from the perspective of the efficiency imperatives, we miss out on another important role for the virtues, or for morality, but specifically for the virtues. So there's a role for making markets and transactions more widespread, mutually beneficial transactions, and creating additional value within these transactions. So some might notice I draw heavily on Bruni and Sugden's work on the role of virtues in markets, although my account differs sharply from theirs because they don't see a role for justice within the market, and I do, as I've mentioned, and so I don't get into this exactly in relation to these virtues, but just kind of worth keeping in mind. So the virtue of fraternity directs agents to care about mutual benefit as such, to see opportunities for exchange as a reason for action, and it increases the range of efficiency enhancing transactions by standing against parochialism, racism, prejudice. So again, in our world, where nationalism, forms of racism and nativism, all these kind of isms are kind of popping up again or remaining. This is a very important virtue, and so this virtue again, it enhances markets by making mutually beneficial exchanges more widespread. So trustworthiness is another virtue that plays a similar role. So it increases the range of efficiency enhancing transactions. If someone is trustworthy, I'm going to be more willing to engage in a transaction with them. So it also increases the value created within existing transactions, by mitigating worries that might be present here. This virtue directs people to treat to treat agreements as distinct reasons for action. So beyond their instrumental benefit, to see the fact that you made an agreement as something that provides you a distinct reason. Of course, it's defeasible, but it provides you a reason for action. Another virtue that's important in this second role is the virtue of respect. So this directs agents to value potential trading partners' preferences and to treat them as reasons for action. And I'm sorry, I opened the question, and so now it's blocking my. It's okay. Directs agents to value, trading partners' preferences and treat them as reasons for action. So again, it's captured by the slogan, "The customer is always right." But it enhances the value created within transactions. So valuing subjectivity or the person as such. So this is seeing the fact that someone wants something a certain way as giving you a reason to make that happen. And again, this is a kind of a subtle consideration, but I think it makes a big difference within markets. And so we should think of it as a virtue. And so it also, avoids paternalism and the exploitation of market power. So this relates also to the first function of the virtues, or you might say that this virtue also fulfills some of this kind of first function of eliminating or mitigating market failures, but it also has a role in enhancing markets as well. So finally, this virtue of perceptiveness. So this is a virtue of entrepreneurial judgment. This makes new transactions possible by increasing the scope of mutually beneficial transactions. So it directs agents to care about value creation as such. And it's a manifestation of practical wisdom in a commercial context. This has actually been discussed in some of the literature on strategic management, especially, for instance, in dynamic capabilities, and seeing this as a kind of key role for managers and directly linked with practical wisdom. So again, this is an important virtue and one that plays this role in enhancing the scope of markets. So this links, of course, with this issue of dynamic efficiency, which I don't get into here, but I think is an important complication for the market failures approach. So why the MFA needs virtue? So here I'm going to conclude. So morality has a further role beyond preventing market failures. So the virtues expand the scope of mutually beneficial transactions and enhance the value created within existing transactions, leading to higher levels of efficiency. So a key question is for business ethics would be what virtues are needed for well-functioning markets and what processes facilitate the capacity for judgment represented by the virtues. So again, I think it takes us beyond the perspective of thinking about rules and thinking about moral development as being a central component of ethics, of business ethics. So here, just to conclude, moral rules, including the efficiency imperatives, or lack determinacy. So virtues such as justice, honesty, and practical wisdom as a capacity for judgment make these norms concrete. And then also key virtues such as fraternity, respect, trustworthiness, and perceptiveness also play an additional role beyond the efficiency imperatives, promoting higher levels of efficiency, greater value creation within existing transactions and facilitating new transactions. So business ethics should focus on how virtues are developed and sustained in a market society. So again, I think rules, including things like the efficiency imperatives, have an important role to play, but these are secondary. They can make they play a role in educating people. They make certain types of reasons that are common salient or give kind of focus to them, but they're not sufficient on their own. So yeah, so that concludes. I think I'm right at time here. So
Thanks so
thank you
much,
guys.
Caleb. Thank you. That's really fascinating. And I think I can speak for everyone when I say that you've given us a lot of things to think about. I'd just like to remind everyone in the audience to please use the Q&A function to type their comments and questions, and then Alan and I will go through them and we will relay them to Caleb. Before we go to the audience's questions, though, I'd like to ask you one of my own. Some of the points you made during your presentation sounded a bit like a business case for virtue to me. You said that in certain contexts, the virtues would enhance value creation and increase efficiency. They would increase the scope of transactions. So it really sounded like a business case. Was that what you were trying to do? And if so, is that perhaps maybe a little bit of a contradiction in terms?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say exactly a business case, but I think in an important sense, the MFA is correct to see efficiency or different aspects of performance as being important. I might disagree exactly about. I mean, I think firms are more focused on dynamic efficiency, but seeing different forms of efficiency as being key values within market context. So I don't see this as reductive, and I think part of the value of essentially a kind of particularist kind of approach to virtue ethics is that we can appreciate that often concerns with efficiency are most important, are most salient, and being virtuous will be about promoting again efficient transactions or dynamic efficiency, innovativeness, different things in the firm, without claiming that they always are. So they're of course defeasible, and so this is I think another issue to be addressed is, for instance, when does it make sense to say that we should sort of step out of this institutional context and appreciate that some other sort of values are important or some other sort of goals are important. Some of the work that I've seen that actually addresses this is I think it's slipping my mind the exact, but they call it a responsibility to protect or to. So it's about the role for societal institutions to prevent genocides and these kind of extreme events, and there's been some work about the role of business as well. So this would be a clear example where companies operating in certain contexts, it may be that because of this kind of catastrophic and kind of horrific events that could happen, they have a greater responsibility. So nothing that I say denies any of these kind of things, but I do think that the MFA is correct to see efficiency again in different forms as being central to market context. And so this is kind of the sense in which, although I critically engage with the MFA, I'm also kind of heavily indebted to it in terms of how the outlook.
Okay, thank you, Alan.
Thanks, Rita. So I had it might just be the same question again, but I had a very similar concern. I had a bunch of concerns, but let me ask the first one. And if you think that I understand that markets should be efficient most of the time. My training is in economics, and one wouldn't it seems wrong to throw away resources, but surely, the way that you're talking about markets as things that achieve efficiency makes them something like tools. So we have our lives, we do stuff, markets do things efficiently, then we have more resources to do our lives with. But in some sense, it sounds as if your account places markets and life in organizations outside of the mainstream of our lives. And yet for most people, life is lived inside for-profit firms. And I wonder if a for-profit firm that focuses only on the importance of efficiency might be the sort of place where the development of virtues becomes impoverished because people stop thinking about other important things. So it might be that you become more efficient if you're more just, or more honest, or more trustworthy, or more fraternal, or more respectful. But maybe if your only concentration is on efficiency, you lose sight of the development of those virtues, and in some sense we become morally impoverished. Is that a danger with an approach that accepts the main tenets of the MFA?
So yes, I mean, I would agree. And so I think, so this is where I had said in the beginning about, I think we can't understand the ethics of markets without without linking it with the ethics of firms. And so so I think that one big problem, aside from this issue of indeterminacy, one big problem with the MFA is that it doesn't really get the role for ethics within firms correct. And so so first off, I think it's mistaken to think that firms are focused on static efficiency. So I think the firms are actually much more focused on dynamic efficiency. And so this is again this kind of entrepreneurial sort of focus. And so I think that to actually achieve dynamic efficiency, much of the most interesting work in strategy and in organization theory has been about how firms, so it's been against the Coasian view. So things like the kind of the knowledge-based view of the firm. So basically that firms achieve dynamic efficiency by essentially creating types of moral communities. So they can draw upon more robust forms of motivation than are possible within market transactions. So Paul Adler, Kogut and Zander's work. So a lot of this work and about knowledge within the firm, I think, is extremely important. And so in a sense, my answer would also be something like a business case. But I think in a sense, again, the kind of business case is to say that instituting robust pro-social purposes can actually have an extremely important role in being able to facilitate dynamic efficiency. So I see the firm as an important counter to the ethos of the market. So the market, I think, is not a morally vacuous area, but it is precarious, and that the increasing importance of knowledge in production and all these sort of developments make it even more plausible to see something like again, the kind of virtue ethical account of firms as moral communities. And so that's sort of how I would fit these together.
Okay. Rita.
I have a question here from Jeff Moore that is something that I've been wondering about as well. And I think when you answer it, you might answer some of the other questions I had related to my first one. So Jeff is asking about levels of analysis here. So at what level do the virtues that you've been discussing operate? Is it individual, organizational, market? And if it is market, what do market virtues actually mean?
So individual. So I'm only talking about individual level virtues. So and so market virtues are excellences, qualities of character that make people's actions good in a market context. So I mean, I don't have time I didn't have time to spell out here, but I think that we shouldn't think about. I mean, so we can talk about the cardinal virtues, but we shouldn't really think about these as being sort of again determinate before the fact. I mean, they become determinate. So what they require depends on the context, and so there's no sort of just context where justice, courage, temperance, and practical wisdom operate. I mean, it's always in some kind of special kind of institutional context. And so, although we can talk about these cardinal virtues, virtues of markets, virtues of firms, virtues of political organizing, these are key sources for what we actually mean when we talk about somebody being virtuous. So I don't see these as secondary. So these are just the virtues that have an important role, in living well in a market context.
Okay, thank you, Alan.
I have a question about dynamic efficiency, and so does Matthew Caulfield. So I'm going to combine the question he's asked with the question I wanted to ask. So when you talk about justice as being something that allows, I understand, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that, particularly with regard to externalities, the MFA fails to give us any guidance and that we need judgment. I just wonder if epistemically we're capable of supplying that judgment ourselves. So the sort of earliest protagonist that I can think of a dynamic efficiency approach towards markets is Hayek, who famously says that no one person can judge what's good and what's bad, and therefore we simply operate in a market system that will eventually evolve in a way that achieves the right thing. So the idea that we can double guess the market and come up with a more just outcome for him is a fatal conceit. So that's one concern I have about the dynamic efficiency notion and the use of justice to try and accomplish it. Matthew Caulfield has another question that I think is interesting, which is, if you're concerned with dynamic efficiency and you're saying that firms ought to pursue dynamic efficiency, and when you exercise the virtue of justice, that's what you're concerned with, are you essentially compelling people to subject their lives to the lives of people in the future, and therefore, in some sense, to subjugate their own flourishing? I know those are two almost orthogonal questions, but they do have the same subject matter.
Yeah. Okay. So this is so as far as the first point, yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, I mean, Hayek's view is essentially countered by a kind of more a more kind of robust idea about the goals or goods that are important to human life. So I mean, I want to kind of be cautious here. So I don't see, first off, I mean, an additional and so the more robust goals of human life that are important for human life, but also for the role of political institutions as well. And I mean, he's quite pessimistic of the possibilities for this. So I mean, so a sort of third aspect of this, which of this project, is to engage with the limitations of institutions. So I think just like virtue has a role within markets in promoting Pareto efficiency, and in firms in promoting dynamic efficiency, it also has a role in internalizing externalities within through political processes, through political organizing. So a lot of the work about political corporate social responsibility, I think, relates directly to the MFA. And in a certain sense, you might say that the kind of organizing they're discussing is an efficiency imperative. And so we can kind of link this up and say that, so we can see this from a kind of a complete perspective. So, as far as Hayek's concerned, I mean, I think that we both need an ethics of markets, and we both also need an ethics of kind of radical critique of markets, and that we don't get this kind of perspective without seeing both together. And as far as, subjugating people's lives to the future, I think it's an important answer to that is about the goods that are achieved through pursuing dynamic efficiency. So, again, goods like meaningful work, development of human capacities. So all these kind of aspects that have been noted by virtue ethicists, but also by some of the literature in OB, I think is a kind of an answer to this concern about instrumentalizing the present. Ideally, there's a kind of harmony there. Of course, it doesn't always work out, but this would be the claim.
Thank you. Rita.
Thank you. Grant Roseboom is asking a question here that is beautifully expressed, so I'm just going to read it in case I ruin it. So Grant says he's certainly sympathetic to the idea that we need to theorize virtues to understand ethical conduct in business and markets. And he's wondering about how to properly understand the basis of the various market-related virtues that you discussed. So he raises two issues. First, many people, including Heath, notice an important cleavage between interactions within markets and interactions within firms, given how firms involve centralized command and control structures And secondly, the virtues you mentioned seem connected to broader virtues that extend to interpersonal contexts outside of firms and markets. So, for example, respect for one's neighbor or trust of fellow citizens. Is there some unifying basis for understanding the virtues as traits that are properly enacted across these various contexts? So, respect for competitors, co-workers, and neighbors. And if so, doesn't that limit the extent to which we can derive the virtues from the efficient functioning of markets?
Yeah, thanks for this question. So first off, I think that the MFA is really short-sighted in its reliance on Coase. And I mean, again, of course, Coase is brilliant and foundational for the theory of the firm, but we need to look at his reception within strategy. And I think that a lot of the work, again, I mentioned work like Paul Adler's and the knowledge-based view of the firm, especially Kogut and Zander's work, but again, there's many other perspectives. Essentially, that we can't understand market failures on their own. We also need to appreciate hierarchical failures. And so, what do firms do to account for the limitations of the ability to use command and control? And again, often in the literature, what is pointed to are notions of ethics and notions of purpose, ethics, abilities to credibly institutionalize values within the firm play a big role in the firm's ability to achieve dynamic efficiency or whatever it is, sustainable competitive advantage, performance, value creation. So, I think that without challenging the MFA on this point, we don't really get it. How does ethics relate to the firm? And in a sense, I mean, the MFA takes it that ethics largely has this sort of extrinsic role in sort of governing interactions in the market, but and it notes that, okay, there's another role within the firm, but it kind of thinks of these as two different issues that can be settled separately. And I don't think it's the case. And in fact, I mean, again, much of the literature also, I mean, Colin Mayer here has done a lot about purpose, the purpose of the firm, and kind of on this point, essentially that having a purpose means commitment. And so the firm's actions in the market is often going to be an expression of the kind of moral perspective that grounds their ability to produce, efficiently. So anyway, I think it's a much more complicated story here. Now, as far as what links together the virtues? Well, I don't think that there is any higher norm that links together the virtues, and that this is part of being, essentially a particularist. And so I think that the virtues get their determinate content from the institutions and roles that people play. And so what links them together is essentially, practical wisdom and a unified life. So our ability to bring together all these different spheres in a coherent way. Now, it may not always be possible. I mean, sometimes we live a tragically, a tragic life where, we can only be alienated. But to the extent that that's not the case, then it's judgment, it's practical wisdom that links these all together. Yeah. So, but thanks for those. Those are good questions.
Thanks, Alan.
We're running very low on time. We've got a bunch of questions, all of which I'd like to raise, but we have time for one. Maybe if I combine two, we could do that. So I'm going to combine Judith Scholar's question with Matt Vickers. So Matt says he's interested in the practical difference between virtues as concepts and virtues in execution. His day job is the UK's energy ombudsman, and many of the challenges he sees are failures of execution, of embodied virtue rather than fails of moral judgment. So he'd like to know how you operationalize virtue. And I guess relatedly, Judith wants to understand more about the difference between virtues and values. So those are two really hard questions. You have 4 minutes. Take it away.
Yeah. So thanks. Well, first, as far as Matt's kind of question, I mean, look, this is a complicated issue, and it goes way back. This is like the Socratic thesis, right? Virtue is knowledge, or what. So I take the view that that virtue on its own, so virtue is a form of knowledge, and so I wouldn't really see these as kind of separate. So I don't think it's a matter of just just implementation. It's a question of someone who has adequately developed the virtues. In practice, I think that means that if in general terms people can kind of make judgments about how things should be done, but they don't actually act on them, then that means that people's capacities for judgment are not sufficiently developed where they concretely see those reasons for action that would make them do what needs to be done, right? For what the virtues require. And then as far as the difference between virtues and values, I mean, again, there's different ways of using these terms, but in my sense, I mean, what's important is that virtues are capacities that are only made concrete by their actual implementation through judgments. And the same thing for values. Values are abstraction. So if we want to talk about what a value is, we actually have to actually see how is it concretely acted upon. And so these are, I don't see these as two separate things. I see any discussion of the virtues that would see them as sort of like pre-given is it's just vacuous. And the same thing with values. So I'm not sure if that exactly answers that.
In 3 minutes, that was amazing. Okay, Rita.
I think we don't have time for more questions, and I apologize to everyone who put questions and comments into the Q&A box, but I promise that we'll get all of them to Caleb, so he will be aware of them. And I guess I'll just take these last couple of minutes to thank Caleb again for being here today and for this brilliant, thought-provoking seminar. It's been amazing. And I'd also like to thank everyone in the room for coming and to advertise the next seminar, which is going to take place in a couple of weeks. So on the 23rd of February at the same time, so 4 p.m. GMT. And we're going to have Toby Sharding with us, who is an assistant professor of management and global business at Rutgers Business School. And Toby is going to be talking on the utility of trust, interpersonal, institutional, and technological. So please do register if you haven't already. And I hope to see many of you again in 2 weeks. So thanks again, Caleb.
Thank you so much. Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye.